as we move more into the future, the climate is going to start to impact more and more aspects of our daily lives. And this is why I'm so excited to have Chris Gloninger join the podcast today to talk about climate tech and basically where we are today in climate mitigation and climate adaptation. I'm Jarrett Carpenter, and this is Future Signal. Chris, thanks for taking the time for hopping on the pod. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Yeah, enjoying some nice fall weather.
Enjoying some nice fall weather. Well, right now, as we record this, I am in South America. You are up in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I actually am flying on a red eye tonight, so I will be back there tomorrow, and I'm excited for that fall weather because I think there's like that perfect moment of fall weather, and then all of a sudden it's death. So anyway, so I want to give a little context for people. I reached out to you on IG. I saw a video that you did on Instagram, and I was like, this is great. And I've told you the background, and some people who are going to be watching this know the background, but years ago when this show had a different branding, I was focusing on climate. I stepped away from climate for my mental health because it was really taxing. And I also just was more drawn to tech and some other things. But we're back with climate. Climate is super, super important. And climate is having to do more and more with tech. So let's dive in. I've asked you to prepare some things. If you haven't, it's cool. I know the world's moving at 1,000 miles per hour. But before we get into any of that, why don't you give a background as to who you are and why I am bringing you on, and I feel like you're the climate guy.
Yeah, for me, this journey began actually during Hurricane Sandy in 2012. I was down in New York City covering the storm. It was kind of wild. I grew up down there, and to see it unfold was kind of wild. We went through this drought of storms, and then we had several big impactful storms within that 2011-2012 timeframe, and then I really started my climate journey, that these storms are supercharged, they're causing more damage, they're more intense, they're affecting more people, and that's kind of taken me for the last almost 15 years.
Okay, 2012. I was in when was that in 2012? In my head, it was like May or June. Is that right?
No, it was actually fall. It was a fall storm that year.
Okay.
You might be thinking about Hurricane Irene, which was the year before, which moved through earlier in the summer. Also a pretty catastrophic storm. But then Sandy was right before Halloween of that year.
Got you. Okay, and Sandy, just because now that was somehow 13 years ago.
Yeah.
Sandy, this makes sense. Sandy happened when I was actually in Colombia. I was in South America, and I have really good friends that were up in New York, and they started sending me pictures and videos. And this is like kind of I don't want to say the dawn of social media, because I think the dawn of social media was like MySpace and then Facebook in like 05, 06, 07. But this was when you had iPhones. Here, I'll hold up my iPhone. And you had apps, and then everyone could kind of be like the on-street meteorologist when this was happening. But I remember very vividly what that looked like. And just because that was 13 years ago, which somehow happened, and I can't believe time is flying that quickly, can you give us a recap of the devastation and why that was such a seminal moment in like northeastern hurricane storm history?
At the time, I was working for a TV station in Albany, New York, and I encouraged station management the next day to go down to the city because I said, really, we haven't seen anything like this. In my lifetime, it had been generations since we've seen a storm of this magnitude, and they agreed to it. So I went down, and people might remember seeing Breezy Point in Queens burning to the ground, and firefighters couldn't even get there. That was our proposed destination, but we couldn't even get there. There were large yachts in the middle of Broad Channel, Queens, which is kind of the connector between the mainland and the barrier beaches, and you had search and rescue crews going door to door because the water was as high as some of the rooftops in those towns. And it truly was eye-opening that we hadn't seen this amount of destruction in so long. And a lot of this storm was supercharged by the warm ocean waters. This was a storm that happened around Halloween when water temperatures are cooling. These storms need warm water, and that's kind of their jet fuel. And it supercharged that storm and turned into what we know now as Superstorm Sandy. So really was that climate wake-up call for New York City, that oh my God moment. We're really not prepared for this.
Let's just use New York City as an example here. and maybe it's a microcosm of the rest of the country. Because when I think about Sandy, I remember seeing the videos of like the subway being full and them being like, this is billions and billions of dollars of damage in just 12 hours or 24 hours. And since every time it rains a lot, there's some borough or some part of New York City where I just see like a video of a minivan driving through 3-foot water or a meter water for those on the metric system. And I'm just kind of like, oh man. So maybe as a microcosm, and as we start to get into the idea of preparedness, or maybe we've changed the word to now resiliency, or maybe we're just in a survival. How has New York done, and let's use that as a microcosm, and then we can expand more nationally as we focus on the climate. And I think we're going to focus on the context of the United States. How has New York done since that? Because that to me was like the canary in the coal mine.
I do want to talk on our technologies, which I know we're going to dive into, because I think New York is a progressive city, not just politically, but what they're doing for climate change and understanding the risk. Because if you said, look, we're going to see 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise by 2100, you need to adapt to that. That would bankrupt even the biggest city in the United States of America, one of the world's superpowers, right? But now we're able to use technology available to us and prioritize some of those projects to see what we need to do today in order for us to be prepared for tomorrow. And by 2050, 2070, 2100, and New York City has been doing just that, even though it is extremely vulnerable. It's going to take a lot of time. And I'm happy that we're working on doing this adaptation and not just mitigation. Mitigation is critical. Again, some of the technologies we'll talk about do surround mitigation, which is the cutting of CO2, the reason for the problem. So that's mitigation. Adaptation, Jarrett, is when we have projects that build up coastal zones and nature-based solutions by maybe turning industrial urbanized area into park space that can flood. That's what I mean when I say adaptation. And finally, we're taking it seriously because we know these changes are happening and we need to adapt to what is coming.
Love that. And thank you for creating the framework between mitigation and adaptation. I think that that's really important. My background, as I often share on this, is in international affairs. And in international affairs or development work or philanthropy or international aid, every 5 to 10 years, there's a swing in nomenclature and the words that people use. And resiliency was recently like a very hot thing. Sustainability was hot for a while, and then everyone realized it meant nothing. So I also feel like maybe this climate framework that you're sharing with me between mitigation and adaptation is one that is fluid with the times as things evolve. So thank you for laying that out. Let's just dive right in, and thank you for reminding me that, like, you know, the idea of having you on was really to talk about the tech, because when I think about the climate crisis, and sometimes if you talk to certain people, there's a feeling, and I feel like maybe this is because of movies like Armageddon or just like cinema, right, that humans are going to be able to science our way out of it, right? I think about The Martian and Matt Damon, and we're going to science our way out of it is something he says, more or less. Where are we today with sciencing our way out of the climate crisis? Because when I look at it, I'm just like, as you've said, we have one of the most powerful nations and one of the wealthiest nations per capita ever in human existence. And New York City is where the financial heartbeat is kind of the world. Yeah, you have other parts of the world. You have Tokyo, you have London, you have other parts, Hong Kong. But really, if New York ever were to explode because it just gets wiped off the face of the earth by a hurricane, the financial markets and the way that we think about banking globally would be like probably 10 times worse than the financial crisis of '08, just to give people an idea. That's my opinion. So let's dive right in. If there's stuff related to New York, maybe we start there, and then we can start to look at other stuff. Because I know, you know, we have fires, we have droughts, we have in places where we have flooding, we have droughts, right? And we have warmer climate all over, which I know is going to affect agriculture. So maybe is there some stuff that you want to start with that's related to New York, or maybe urban areas, and then we can kind of go out from there?
I think urban areas we can start with, and I know New York has its capabilities with this. The company I work at now for my full-time day job, Woods Hole Group, we're an environmental coastal engineering company, and Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, basically commissioned us to create the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. And this is new technology within the last decade, and we're just scaling it up. So even though it's tech that's been around in the world of climate, it's new tech. And we're looking at it's a hydrodynamic probabilistic flood model. It's a mouthful. It sounds like a word salad, but really what we're looking at is taking a system, a city, and finding the trouble spots and not saying that they're all an issue. They prioritize those issues by vulnerability, which is critical. The old approach used to be a bathtub model when it comes to flooding. So you pick an elevation, fill water up to that point. Anything below that point is flooded. Everything above that water point is high and dry. But we know it's more complex than that. Sea levels are rising. Storms are stronger. There are waves. There's so many things to unpack that this probabilistic model takes into account. And I mentioned New York City, that the price tag to adapt to every single thing to be safe through 2100 would essentially bankrupt the city. You can't undertake all of these infrastructure projects, but this allows communities to prioritize those issues and can focus on, maybe increasing the drainage infrastructure in this area, maybe building the seawall a little bit higher, maybe turning this place into a park instead so water can move through and it's not going to flood communities. So I think that is technology that will be scaled into the next few years for other coastal communities to truly understand the risk that climate change poses.
So, from what I understand, you had a multisyllabic word there, and we love those. But what I think of it is like a triage, right? Mm-hmm. Let's focus on what needs to be focused on the most. The guy comes in with a head wound. We're going to focus on him before maybe the twisted ankle, or I don't know, some other thing that's maybe not life threatening. When you think about the human body, it's basically the brain and the lungs. If you can control those two things, you can normally keep someone alive. Okay, so with what you've just said, I now want to ask you a more specific question about Boston, the Seaport. Okay, I feel like if we look at your triage framework, the Seaport and the billions of dollars that have been invested there was maybe not the best way to think about preparing Boston as just a microcosm and a little example for the climate crisis. And if you're not familiar with the Seaport is exactly what it sounds. It is a port next to the sea in Boston that is in a situation, in such a precarious location, that almost since even before it was finished being built and kind of developed, anytime there would be rain, there was always videos on IG, always videos on TikTok, always videos on YouTube being like, why did Boston spend billions when this thing is already flooding? And the theory, the prevailing theory, is that is only going to continue to worsen as the climate crisis evolves. So in the triage that you have, can we talk about the Seaport?
Yeah. And actually, when I was just rewind a minute, a large part of my career was in Boston. I worked at NBC Boston. I did weekend weather and I did climate change reporting during the week in and around Boston. And I vividly remember having a conversation with then Councilwoman at Large, Michelle Wu. And we talked about that. Like, how could this ever happen? How could we allow this to happen? Now that she's mayor, I know that there are some people who oppose Wu, but I think she is doing just a bang-up job. She's, I think, doing very well as mayor. She even said, she was scratching her head, like, what are we doing? How was this approved? And obviously, we need space and we need to have housing for people in this area. But there's so limited green space and there is limited means for stormwater to flush out of the Seaport. And I'll take you back once more to the January nor'easter in 2017. And Jarrett, if you were smart, you were down in Columbia for that storm.
I don't think I was stateside for that. So
okay.
Yes.
We were covering the storm at Long Wharf, right? And it was surreal. Like, I'm standing there. It's a raging blizzard, and the snow starts turning gray on the ground. And I'm like, what the hell is happening? This doesn't make sense. And I looked and I'm like, oh my God, we're near high tide. And then it was just a big push of water that came in. And then we started seeing video online of the Aquarium T-stop, the blue line, so the public transportation system in Boston, was like a literal waterfall across the street from where we were standing. Like, oh my God. And then all of the buildings, all the fire alarms started to go off. And then they were launching these Zodiac inflatable boats that Boston Fire in the city streets. It was crazy. And this was a scene happening in real time in the Seaport. And that was 2017. And since 2017, there's been even more and more and more and more development. I will say there's a positive. The critical infrastructure, and this is one of those ways that we adapt to climate change, in a lot of the new construction buildings are put up out of the flood zone. The lower floors can flood. However, I will push back and say, if there is an emergency, it's fine if critical infrastructure is safe. But what if there's an emergency with people when there's flooding? How do you get to them? How do you get them out? I don't think that there's a real good answer for that just yet. So yes, it's vulnerable. It's one of those things that I've lost sleep over, just kind of worrying in any major storm. And sea levels are only going to go higher, and storms are only going to get stronger.
Wonderful. And part of that question was because you are based out of Massachusetts. I am stateside based out of Massachusetts. And some of the listeners are definitely highly aware of Boston, aware of the Seaport. And so I love you touching upon that and mentioning WOO, which is great. Let's now transition. Let's get right into the climate tech. So when I reached out, I was like, hey, if you could bring on some things that are climate tech related, that technologies that are helping to either mitigate or adapt, and I think we're more in an adapt, maybe less than a mitigate in some stances, but you'll tell me. Let's talk about those. Maybe you start with the one you think people haven't heard of that is actually being rolled out, not only nationally, but maybe globally.
This is what I'm most excited about, and it is actually a mitigation technique, and they're working on it right now in Southern California. And if you look at waves, right, if you've been to the ocean, no matter where you are in the world, waves are powerful, right? And if you are not into swimming in the ocean or being in an ocean environment, those waves can knock you right down. It's a ton of energy. In fact, if you added up the energy of all the waves as they crash on shore at every beach in the world, that could power 60% of the planet. So there's technology now in LA that they're rolling out that captures that wave energy, the onshore wave energy, before it reaches the shore. And it's this device that essentially has these floats that go down. They almost look like a spoon, and the heavy side of the spoon, or the concave part of the spoon that lays in the water, rises up and down when the waves move through, and then that is turned into energy. That I am most excited about when it comes to tech that can be scalable, because there are intermittency issues with wind and solar, obviously, but battery power has come a long way, so I don't think that that's a huge issue. But for the skeptics that are out there, there are always going to be waves. The ocean's always moving. So that is super exciting. I mean, that's one of those companies that when they go online and become publicly traded, I would go all in on. The other thing I want to say is the downside with wind are those graveyards that you see across North Dakota, South Dakota, of these wind turbine blades that just sit there. They're made out of materials that don't biodegrade, but now there's new tech that allows that material to be recycled, which is huge. That is a game changer for wind. So those are the two mitigation things I'm most excited about right now.
Okay, yeah, and I got super excited after the wave one, and I've seen like prototypes, or I've seen like infographics of the waves, which is very, very, very cool, because of some of the flaws or faults or maybe downsides of wind and solar, as you briefly touched upon there. Could that also like slow waves as like a sea speed bump, so it serves both purposes?
So we call it wave attenuation. It would certainly help absorb the blow of some of those waves before they make it on shore, and actually they're able to turn them into the vertical position, which I believe almost looks like a wall. I do have to research a little bit more into that, but it will prevent them from getting damaged. But I could foresee that actually helping, to your point, to attenuate that wave action to lessen the blow before it hits land, which would be huge, because it's not just, a breaking wave. You're talking erosion, and that push of seawater landward is what is so bad and devastating during storms.
Yeah, throughout the places in the world where I've been, this past January I was in Costa Rica. I've been I was off the coast of Colombia last March. And then more recently, anytime I'm in Massachusetts, some communities, obviously it depends if there's like boats coming through and fishery or some kind of commerce or whatever, or transit, they'll just take huge rocks and they'll put them, you can see like 200 meters off the shore, and they obviously have a specific point and they're just dropping them. This almost seems like a less Stone Age version of that is actually going to create energy and also could slow down the wave. Super, super cool. Well, let's look at the turbines. You're saying some company, some organization, some inventor has figured out a way to be able to break down the turbines when they're no longer in use.
Yeah, which is amazing and can be turned into products like cement, for example. That is game-changing technology. There's a company based in Iowa that is actively working on scaling that technology up so they can do it faster, they can do it a lot more efficiently and effectively. That would be, again, really big because there is a shelf life to these turbines, right? They kind of wear out, they are in all sorts of weather, they begin to break down, and for years, they've just been in these landfills. And again, a lot of climate skeptics will use that as a talking point that this has as much of an environmental impact as fossil fuels. Entirely not true. But this can kind of put that rumor to bed that there's now an option for recycling.
Do you know the life cycle of a turbine blade that's used for wind? How long are we talking?
We're talking decades.
Okay.
Which sounds good, and they've done environmental impact studies that have looked at is it really worth it, right? Because there is this environmental component. And yes, even if we're not able to recycle these components of a wind turbine, they still make sense environmentally because they have such an impact in lowering carbon dioxide. So that shelf life might not seem like a ton. And again, if there's lightning, they have to be replaced much faster than that, right? A lightning strike could certainly take one of them offline. I did see, and this isn't tech, but it's a great way to kind of visualize where we can use these technologies. There are scientists that are actively looking at areas of large hail, right, that can take out an entire solar field. And obviously, that's terrible from a financial means, but also from recycling solar panels. We're now starting to make those decisions that maybe solar isn't the best option here, but we can certainly scale it up in these areas that don't see damaging hail that reach that benchmark or that threshold to cause damage. And I think we'll see the same with wind too, that we're not putting them in areas where they could sustain serious damage, shortening their lifespan.
I love that. And so these are both mitigation on the mitigation side.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Do we have tech to talk about on the adaptation side?
Yeah, it's the world of nature-based solutions, and every day we're improving. And it might not sound like tech, but we're really turning to nature because nature's been around far longer than humans have been around, right? So we turn to nature for inspiration. And we're working on turning oyster beds into natural wave attenuation areas, and they're building it into seawalls to make them less gray infrastructure and more green infrastructure, which is important. If you go into, I'll use another Boston example. There's, I think it's Pier. It's one of the parks in East Boston. I think it's Fan Pier Park, and if you look at it, it doesn't look like anything significant. It's a beautiful park space. There's a playground there. There's this mound that kind of goes up gradually, a grassy mound that goes up from the water and builds elevation landward. And just that one project in finding how we could kind of integrate green space into the problem of the climate crisis, that one little project has actually helped about 10,000 residents. So that is a space that has really grown significantly. I know it may not meet the tech definition, but in a sense, I mean, there's kind of the technology behind the design of this, right? The finding the ways and testing it to make sure it withstands and holds up against stronger storms, rising sea level, and other climate scenarios.
Yeah, and I think I have a couple things. One, I want to point out that like for me, tech is anything that's innovative. It doesn't mean it needs to be plugged in. It doesn't mean it has to be using AI or blockchain. I will forever tell people I think the washing machine is one of the most innovative things ever. And I didn't realize that until I washed my own clothes for about 9 months when I didn't have a washing machine when I was in the Peace Corps in Guatemala. Innovation or technology, I think, is just a way to leverage something so humans have a better outcome and humans can save time, like whatever that is. Sometimes it's not both, but tech can be super, super, super basic. It doesn't have to be super fancy. And then the other thing is, you said it's going to help 10,000 residents. Can you dive into what that means? Is that in the event of a storm, it's going to help protect them, or normally throughout the wear and tear of life, it's going to cut down on, I don't know, salt water getting towards their houses, which we know just kills electronics?
In this case, it's taking what was a flood pathway. And in the field, a flood pathway is defined how water is able to get inland, right? Which path does it take to go from the ocean into areas that are in the built environment? And obviously, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the lowest points. And water wants to take the lowest path to get as far inland as possible. And building up that mound, which aesthetically looks to be done intentionally to kind of make it look like a nice, visual aesthetic, is done in a way that it shuts off that flood pathway, which if left unadapted, that water would be able to rush in during a storm and flood about 10,000 residents behind that mound, which is a huge impact for a project that really isn't that significant. It was already a park, and it was just reimagining that park, which I think is really exciting about how this space is transforming and evolving.
The other thing about tech, just like as I think about tech all the time, right? I think that a rock that holds the door open, that's technology,
Yeah.
right? Like in my opinion. So the fascinating thing about good tech is that you will use it and not know you're using it. And so a lot of people that come on Future Signal are in crypto. And the thing with crypto is always you want people to use crypto and not know that and then not have them know that they're using crypto or blockchain, right? So this to me is super techy because people are benefiting from it and they don't even know that they're benefiting from a climate adaptive tech, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. The day that I was there, and it's actually a project that my company's been working on, so I use some of my TV background to kind of produce some of these video aids for them to kind of show off these projects. And the day I was out there, I mean, it was a beautiful summer day. Boston doesn't have a lot of beach space, especially East Boston. It's all in the water, but there's no beach space. There are people outside sunbathing on this mound in the grass, and they don't realize what they're on is actively protecting their community. And then, down across the way in the north end, there's another really awesome project where they kind of built up. In some cases, you have to go with gray infrastructure and there's no green alternative, but they turned the seawall into a walking path where people were actively fishing. This group of young women were out there having their lunch during lunch break, sitting, enjoying time by the water, whereas a normal seawall would just be this obtrusive, slab of concrete that you wouldn't use and would be an eyesore. So you're right, and that truly is a great way to put it. A lot of these projects people don't even know about, but that's the point. But they're able to enjoy it. So for every dollar that we spend on these projects, and FEMA has come up with this and has researched it over the last few decades, you get $7 back in those recovery costs. And that only looks at the direct impact of the damages left behind. But when you give space for somebody to go for a run on their lunch break or sit and have lunch and get some sun or go fishing, that doesn't have a dollar value, but that really should be incorporated into that formula because it is making people's lives in an urban area a lot nicer because it gives them an option and gives them things to do in a city outside.
Is that number from FEMA, which I just think, first of all, I'm going to now quote you on that because I think it's wonderful. Is that ratio of, what's the word I'm looking for? Is that ratio of like ROI, to put it in a business term?
Exactly.
Is that standard across all climate mitigation or adaptation projects where if we do something and we spend $100, we're getting $700 out on the back end?
Largely, there are projects. So, for example, this is a good example because I like what you just brought up, because there isn't that return on investment. That seawall that everyone talked about from the north side of Boston all the way down to Hull, I believe, they did do an ROI study on that. And it was not 1-to-1. It was a significant loss, and it certainly wasn't, $7 gained. So those projects aren't ever considered, and they're thrown out. And that was one of the driving forces behind looking at these smaller projects like the East Boston and the North End and Long Wharf. Money better spent there that can have local impacts than basically cutting off all of Boston Harbor to the ocean, unless there's marine traffic moving through. But that figure, though, is on average for a lot of these projects, especially small to medium scale projects.
Okay, so I didn't know if we were going to go down this road, but now we have to go down this road because my curiosity is leading me there. The story in my head then is that as this current administration is cutting funding for climate-related anything, what they're doing is they're not spending $1 today to then very likely have to spend $7 tomorrow, in as many words.
When I was in Iowa, so my story there, I don't want to bore listeners, but it ended quite poorly. My time there as chief after my time in Boston. I went out there to talk about climate change. They wanted me to talk about climate change, and I knew moving from Boston to Iowa was not going to be the same audience, right? I tried to find ways to connect with a more conservative audience. And I did it 2 ways, and both ways were effective. The first way was talking about energy independence. Literally, there's wind turbines as far as the eye can see out there. It's flat, and it's filled with farm fields, and that's where wind turbines go on land. And that's true energy independence. We went from a house, when my wife and I moved out there, a house that was almost triple the size of what we lived in Metro West in Boston. And our utility bill was a fraction of the cost. And it was because it was driven on wind. And that's true energy independence. But going back to your point, the other term I used was fiscal responsibility. When we are allowing communities to rebuild the same way in the same footprint without adapting to climate change, that is incredibly fiscally irresponsible. There's a reason why insurance companies are backing out of coastal communities and in areas of high impact. There's a reason why banks aren't wanting to finance property over 30 years that has an increasing risk of flooding or fire or wind. So what is happening now is so far removed from what the true conservative philosophy really is, and that's to be fiscally conservative, because what we are doing now is totally irresponsible, because we're just taking climate change out of the mix for any and all aspects of government right now. Terrifying.
Wow. Okay. Let me reorient because my mind just went a billion different other places. So one of the things, well, first of all, we've talked about climate tech, and I'm glad we've done. We talked about some mitigation. We've talked about some adaptation. And I think I want to say on mic, to put the pressure on, that when I'm back up in Boston, it would be really great for us to meet up in the North End or go over and look at this hill and create some video and just put it up on YouTube so it can exist. We can put it up on Instagram. We can put it up wherever you want. But I think these are really important things for people to see, that like climate, adaptation, mitigation, whatever, these things don't have to be intrusive. And most of the times you're not even going to know it's there, which is really important. The second, and I want to get into questions because I told you even before we started to record that we could probably just focus on questions that I was sent the entire time, and they're interesting. But then finally, third, I want to dive into what you've just brought up, because I think that this may be the most salient point if anyone is listening and you are a homeowner or you are a renter in the United States currently. And that is the risk of climate crisis affecting your domicile, right? Affecting the house where you live in, where you pay your mortgage, or affecting where you rent. One of the things you just brought up is like, oh my gosh, the insurance. When insurance leaves, one of the most canary in the coal mine, and maybe I use that saying too much, but I love it. And just to give people the background on that saying, what happened was back in the day when they didn't have technology in coal mines, they would bring a canary in, they'd bring a bird in. And the birds would fly out of the coal mine when certain gases that were imperceptible to humans, but humans should not be kind of exposed to them, would creep into the mine, right? So there's certain gases that we know that we just can't perceive, but if there's enough of it anyway. So when the canary leaves, that means it's a huge issue. So the canary in the coal mine moment for me was in Florida. Florida, when State Farm left, and maybe this happened 12 to 16 months ago, but they kind of just left in the cover of night. And State Farm, everyone listening knows State Farm, right? So when insurance leave, I start to think, holy crap, is it sustainable to, or is it fiscally responsible, let's use the words you used, to own property or be on the coast when it comes to the climate crisis? So now I'm going to put that to you, and you just put up an Instagram video, and I'll leave that link in the show notes, and it's all about people rebuilding $1 million mansions or building in the first place, or, you know, not, as you said, taking into account the climate crisis when developing real estate. Let's use that. So, okay, all of that's to say, can you talk a little bit about how you think about the climate crisis, real estate, insurance, people's livelihoods, the fact that 60 to 70% of wealth, especially in the middle class, is tied up in their mortgages right now in the U.S.?
Yeah. Look, I took a job where I took a $60,000 pay cut from my job in TV because it was important to me to work and devote my time to the climate crisis. So it's important to me. And moving to Cape Cod, where our choices for insurance were limited, was so difficult because we've actually had that mass exodus too. We have state-funded insurance out on Cape Cod because there are so few insurance companies that are affected by or that are willing to cover residents that are in climate areas. I spoke at a group after the election, and it was really disheartening out on the outer Cape, and I didn't really want to go after the election results, obviously, in 2024. But an older woman in a fixed income, her insurance premium went up $500 a month, $500 a year. And she said, I live on a fixed income, and that's a lot for me to handle. And she's like, that's a climate story, and it truly is. But I will give away my Instagram post because it is completely absurd what we're doing. The last nor'easter I covered before moving to Iowa was in February 2021. And I was friends with the fire chief out there in Sandwich, Massachusetts. We went live, meaning we were standing, waiting for the storm. You've seen meteorologists out in the field before storms and during storms. But where we were live, there was a house for sale. And it was your dream beachfront home. And for some reason, I screen grabbed the Zillow listing, and I don't know why I did, but like the language of the listing, so the dream beachfront home part. The next morning, I woke up to a text. My friend, who's the chief, that said, Chris, that house that you saw, it and like 3 other houses didn't survive. So later that morning, I thought to go back onto Zillow, and the listing changed. To the credit of the real estate agent, he changed it to build your dream beachfront home. And I'm like, holy shit, are we really doing this? Like, what?
Hold on, wait. This is so Black Mirror, right? Because sometimes I don't think that people, and you see it all the time if you're like paying close enough attention, like you were able to see the before and the after. But let's assume that I come along and I have my family and I see that and I'm wealthy enough to buy that house. I think it was like $4 million or something.
Yeah.
I mean, man, marketing really is the new spin, you know?
It is. And I mean, to see that rebuilt, I mean, actually, it went back on because I'm giving a talk, a climate talk, and I wanted an update, and it was sold. That lot was sold. And yeah, there's a $4 million house in that lot now. And I'm thinking, you know, I know it's buyer beware, and I get that. But at the same point, even if you have the money and you are super rich, I don't know any rich person that would be willing to just flush $4 million down the drain. And the flip side is the Malibu lot that was part of my Instagram reel, and it burnt down. And it's comedic if you look at the aerial view of this lot. It's literally road, rubble, and ocean. I mean, you got twofold. You got rising sea level, and then you have a foundation that's reduced to nothing because of the fires in the Pacific Palisades. And that lot was $1.5 million just to build on. So we're doing this, and the insurance companies are moving away. And even if you, again, have the money to do it, are you really... I don't know. It's a scary situation that we're in. And the world of explaining the risk to people is so convoluted. It's so dumb. Like a 1% chance of occurrence. That's a 100-year event. It's a moving target now. These events are happening more frequently. That was based on a stable climate. The climate's not stable. But now what we're saying is, well, if that 1% risk per year, cumulatively over a 30-year mortgage, there's a 30% chance your property is going to flood over 30 years. So would that change your mind in buying that property? Right? Because if there's a 1% chance it's going to go outside, you're going to go outside and it's going to rain today, you're not going to bring an umbrella, right? You just wouldn't. But would your mind and the way you think about your future, would that change if you know that that risk is close to 30%? There's a 30% chance that your property is going to flood. Would you think differently? Would you reconsider?
How are you approaching this personally? And you don't have to share this. This is more of a personal question, right? But how are you and your family looking at this? Are you renting, or are you got the mortgage and you're just, the statistics and you're keeping all your valuables on the second floor? Or what are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I strategically, while I would love to live right on the beach, we found a place. That is the first thing I do. I look at flood risk of that property. And if it is zero, because it's high and dry, nothing is truly 0%, I was confident enough. But there were houses that I rolled out, Jarrett, out of the gate when we moved back from Iowa, that I was like, absolutely not. I'm absolutely not going to consider that, even if it's a good deal. I'm not dealing with the house and flooding. And if anyone has lived through a flood, it is a true, absolute nightmare.
The thing that I think, and I've been saying I'm going to write an article on this because my friends will ask, or I'll share this opinion, and it's not a very sexy opinion to share in the suburbs of Massachusetts, that you shouldn't have a mortgage and you should rent. Part of that is because financially, and I talk about the financial responsibility on this show. But the other thing is the risk analysis. And I do think that there are, for example, like your home and like my father's home, they're high and dry, right? When you look at the flood chances, they're super low. And we tried to get flood insurance on the house like 10 years ago, and we were just like surfing around, and no one would give it to us because it just made no sense for us to even, like, no one would cover it because they're like, you're not near it. But I want to share my theory on this and then get your feedback, is that let's say you have the house that's a mile inland and it's up on a hill a little bit. It's like 200 feet up on elevation. My theory is, let's just say it's $1 million. My theory is that house will lose value when the seaside properties are no longer insurable and people just stop living there. There will be a domino effect. And now that house isn't worth $1 million. Now it's worth $900,000 because that seaside community becomes less attractive to live in and basically take a mortgage on and take on debt with a bank. Does that align? Have you seen that before in other communities? We live in a world right now where we have entire countries like Vanuatu, which is out in the Pacific, which is currently in the process of moving all of their citizens to another country because their current country is no longer able to be in. And so in that world, I look at the coastal communities of Massachusetts, the coastal communities of Florida, the coastal communities of Texas, of California. We have so much coast in the United States, and that's what comes to me. Is that theory at all? Have you seen any of that? How does that align?
I think there's going to be a lot of stranded assets in this world of, even if you are high and dry. Because if you think about it, a lot of the pricier properties are going to be the ones at the coast. And when you have those higher property taxes that essentially are the engine of your town, what happens when those communities, what happens to when those houses are gone and that tax revenue is cut off? That makes that town a lot less valuable. So to your point, I absolutely think that the property value, even if you're high and dry and you are perfectly safe, is going to go down because the prices that are driving it up, not just the real estate on the water, but usually good schools, good downtowns, public safety, all of that is part of that equation, won't be funded the way it should be funded anymore.
Yeah, the tax basin is a very, very, very serious thing. And yeah, that's a perfect way to look at that. Let's dive into questions now. Many of the questions actually relate back to AI, which is one of the larger topics that I'd like to look into and cover. And this is the first time we're actually going to get into the economic part of that, because many of the questions when I ask people, here we go. How does the impact of LLMs? What is the impact of data centers? So we'll get there. But before we get there, let's stick more without getting into the AI rabbit hole. And so this is a question from my buddy Aussie, and he says, and this is a long question, and hopefully you'll be able to pull some stuff out here. He says, what actions are more impactful in the climate change action? So let me rephrase that because you used action twice. So he says, what actions are most impactful when thinking about how to, let's say, mitigate or adapt to climate change? Restoration, and then he has, ecological, rewilding, agricultural projects, green infrastructure projects, renewable, public, active transit, asphalt reduction initiatives, or prevention action, stopping new oil refineries, blocking new polluting activities.
That's a really great question. And I think at this point, it needs to be evenly spread between efforts. Okay. And a lot of what he said there is broken into the mitigation, adaptation, the two terms that we defined early on in this conversation. First and foremost, the one thing I don't think he said is the R&D side of it. And I think that that's a critical component that also needs to hold weight in this part of the conversation. I would say the most important thing is stopping the problem. So that goes into the R&D and then stopping new projects in the oil, coal, and gas industry. Then I would probably the second tier would be the nature-based solutions, and that's all of that environmental green infrastructure. That's the restoration of marshland. Marshlands serve as that flood barrier for communities. All of that kind of is in that same kind of under that same umbrella, and then the gray infrastructure, building that up. Those bigger scale projects. But I think a lot of those adaptation projects can be done on a smaller scale, done in a green, environmentally friendly way that can have many co-benefits. But the fact that we are still investing in I saw Lee Zeldin, the EPA administrator, who was a congressman in New York near my parents' district, and he was posing with coworkers. And I don't think anyone should be without a job. But look, the Biden administration did a great job in trying to find ways to retool and re-educate and give early retirement to people in the coal sector, especially. But he's in this new coal facility where they're mining coal, and literally, if you just think of the stupidity of it, it is such an expensive source of energy. It's like bragging that you're using dial-up still when Wi-Fi technology is available. Like, that's the level of stupidity that we're dealing with. Like, you're saying that, but yet the supporters are eating it up. They think it's the greatest thing ever. So that really is, I know it's a long-winded answer to that question, but that's what we really need to be, we need to be stopping immediately, are those new projects. And then it's the research and development into finding new technology, like that onshore wave capture system that turns onshore waves into energy. We need to be doing more of that and finding other sources of renewable energy.
Love that. Aussie has another question, which I think is one worth saying here on mic. He says, what is your opinion on the links between climate change and human health? Is climate change leading to greater negative health outcomes? Mm-hmm.
I forget the exact figure, but I recently read through, I think it was a Lancet publication, research publication, that said that you can directly attribute, it's in the tens of billions of dollars each year to healthcare costs directly tied to climate change. While I was in Iowa, the smoke from Pacific Northwest and Canadian wildfires was suffocating, made its way down to the surface. And I had an emergency department doctor, this is the second half of COVID, who reached out to me and said, you're talking about climate change on the air. Can you talk about how this smoke is making our jobs more difficult because people here are not taking COVID seriously, but they're ending up in the emergency departments. But now we have all these people with asthma, COPD, emphysema that are now showing up, that are having attacks or episodes because of the smoke. He's like, we're overwhelmed, like our wait times and the hours. So you can kind of see, even if it's not directly tied to climate change, you're seeing these fringe effects that are directly having impacts on our healthcare system. We also have issues like where tick diseases are going crazy. In Martha's Vineyard, for example, there are 2 restaurants that have alpha-gal menus. So it is a tick, the Lone Star tick, that actually makes you allergic to mammal products. Milk, cheese, beef, pork, all of it. And you can get an anaphylactic reaction. You can die from it. And there's evidence that this is directly tied to climate change. These ticks are moving into new environments. They are living throughout the entire season. They're not dying off during the winter. And the rates and cases are exploding. So there's a direct tie, and it's a tie that isn't made. And there's an opportunity, because if you look at your one-on-ones with scientists in your life, the scientist that you're going to be talking to the most is your medical doctor. And I think that there needs to be that education, because people trust their doctors oftentimes, even people that are politically conservative. And if they're weaving those things in, like, look, we never had this disease that you have 10 years ago, but now we do, because ticks are sticking around, because they're not dying off in the winter. Winters are warming. That's what we need. We're just not seeing it, at least in a big enough scale to make a difference. But there's a direct tie between climate and healthcare.
I want to say that I have so many questions myself that I can ask you. I want to ask so many things about globally, who's doing well, who's doing better. What is China doing? Is China really stopping the coal? Are they really going all in solar? Are they going to lead the green revolution that we should be leading? Many, many things. Ideally, you'll come back on. But I want to now go into the AI questions, because I think that they're really great. The first one is from my buddy Jeff. He is what I call an energy czar of a local town in Massachusetts. He focuses on sustainable energy solutions for the town. He says, what is the impact of the data center AI push in the US, given that the new generation for this massive electricity demand will come from primarily natural gas generation?
I'm absolutely terrified of it. I mean, not just with the electric demand. I read and researched that, if you have ChatGPT write one email for you, that's the equivalent of a bottle of water. And both on the petroleum side, the fact that it's a plastic that has similar impact of a single-use plastic bottle, but also the water that it actually requires to produce that product. One email. Multiply that by how many people are using it day to day, using it for their jobs. I think that it's an exciting advancement, because the climate world is embracing some of the technology to do modeling, to assist with some of the coding that's behind it. But there are a lot of uses which I'd argue have such a huge environmental impact. If these were outfitted with solar or directly tied to wind, I could be more on board. But I'm really turned off by the environmental impact that they're having, and that's only going to grow. And to your point, the emissions just from the natural gas, everyone said it's the cleanest of the fossil fuels, but it's the most potent when it comes to methane byproducts as well. And methane is a far stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
Yeah, I think methane's like 30 or 25 to 30 times worse per volume, if you will. Okay, so he says, another question actually going back to Aussie, says, how does he view the impact of LLMs on climate mitigation efforts? We're kind of very similar question, the one that Jeff had. Does their high energy demands outweigh their investment in green/renewable energy infrastructure? And let me add a caveat to this. Is there a future that you see in which ChatGPT and OpenAI, for example, as much energy and as much bad shit that they maybe do for the environment, is there a way to somehow offset that so you're still at a net negative or at a zero?
The large language models I think, look, they're going to be important in a lot of components in life and even in the climate world. What I don't like and what I think are a total and complete throwaway are carbon offsets. I think that there should be a price for carbon. I do. But investing in carbon capture technology, I think is a bunch of BS. I really think that is just putting lipstick on a pig. There are countries like like Iceland that have done an efficient job in sequestering carbon through carbon capture, but I don't think that technology, I don't think we have the money to scale that up, which would be a big concern and a big worry. But I don't think that any of these, trade-offs to make it greener are any good unless you're really truly powering it by a sustainable source. That's the only way that we can really do it.
I have more questions, but I'm going to hold them for a sec. I want to make two comments. One is that I saw this yesterday on Instagram. It said mosquitoes are, because you mentioned Iceland. Mosquitoes found in Iceland for first time as climate crisis warms country. 3 specimens discovered in what was previously one of the few places in the world without insects. Whew. Just wanted to throw that fun fact out there, right? Just really lighten the mood. And then I have two more follow-ups, and then we're gonna probably, I'll let you go, even though I could talk your ear off about this, and even after we stop recording, I'll continue to talk your ear off. But one of them is, what are you doing specifically that you think is like, I'm Chris, I'm one human being. What is the one thing I can do? Because people listening, and I think the climate crisis becomes overwhelming when it's like, yeah, you can do all these things. You could walk to work, you could ride your bike, you could do this, but then that like the US military is polluting more in 1 hour than you'll ever do in 5 lifetimes, right? And I just say that to bring context to the situation. So with that said, what are you doing and what is your family doing and what would you recommend people do? Maybe this is advocacy, maybe this is part actual active, something that they're doing, but how do you approach that?
Yeah, and actually another stat to go along with that, every billionaire that's out there emits more, I believe, either 30 or 60 minutes than a normal human does in an entire lifetime, which is pretty disturbing. I will say EVs and getting rooftop solar might not be financially attainable for a lot of people. I also think that there's an environmental impact of getting rid of a perfectly good car just to switch over to an EV that will end up in a landfill. I think that if you can, do it. But the single action that everyone can do, as corny and cliched as this sounds, is talk about it and find ways to incorporate climate change into their communication and find the connections, right? If you're seeing a 75-degree day during the winter, talk about, instead of celebrating it, why this is abnormal for people. Have the conversations that we're having right now in this podcast about how insurance companies are leaving. Talk about those prices. For God's sake, we heard how much about egg prices going up before the election. But yet, like, the price of everything else that's driven by climate change takes the back seat. So those are the conversations that people should have, and that's an individual action that costs nothing. And it's by listening to things and reading things that have that climate thread that people can take and internalize, that costs nothing, but that we can all do. That's what I do. I speak around the country, virtually, in person. I do it for free because I think it's important. But anything that people can do that they feel comfortable with, I encourage you, because it's individual action since we've taken such a big step back at the federal level.
Wonderful. This is the last question I have here is one that I try to ask most people. Sometimes I forget about it, but I'm really excited to share this with you. And that is the idea of signal and noise, right? So what is the noise right now around the climate crisis or climate change? And then what is the signal?
I think the noise is the climate anxiety to the point of being paralyzed. And I think that's, to me, so much the noise. People are like, there's nothing we can do. I'm just one person. There's nothing I can do about it. But that's just simply not true. So, and then the noise, I think, that is fueled by the fossil fuel industry that just gains so much steam and momentum online. Those are the tweets. Those are the threads that are amplified, are ones of misinformation and disinformation. I think the signal that we look out for is the actions like we are seeing in Boston, the work behind the scenes that's still being done at Park in the North End or in East Boston that are happening. That's the critical work that needs to be done. It's the people that are showing up during a No Kings protest and letting their voices be heard. That is the positive, and I really encourage people to not be paralyzed by it and to see the hope and to see that there's a lot of good to come out of climate action, a lot of benefits for day-to-day life and, keeping a sustainable future for, future generations.
Absolutely love that. I think that's a great way to end this episode. I'm going to go ahead and put all your socials. I know you're on X, Instagram, and wherever else you can share this with me. And I'll put those in the episode description. I'm also going to put specifically that Instagram reel that we mentioned, the one that has the property in Malibu that's literally in sand. And then as well as it points out the property in Massachusetts that went from a dream house, buy your dream house, to build your dream house. So I'll put all those in. Chris, this has been wonderful, and thank you so much for taking the time and hopping on. If you're watching this, subscribe on YouTube. If you're listening to a podcast platform, please subscribe, and make sure you're following us at Future Single XYZ. Chris, thank you once again for taking the time.
Jarrett, thanks, my friend.